Perfect.
So I'm going to give David the proper introduction he deserves. So it's Dr. David Weiss. He's the president and CEO of Weiss International, a Toronto-based firm specializing in innovation, leadership, and HR consulting for Fortune 500 social enterprise and public sector organizations. David and his team of organizational consultants generate business, organizational, and people solutions for executive and boards globally. I know you're highly regarded in the HR world, so we're very privileged to have you here today. So thanks so much, David.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm wondering if people could just go to the chat and just enter the kind of industry or business that you are in or representing, just so I can have a sense of, are we mostly public sector, are we mostly private sector? So I can just give you some examples that might be really relevant to your environment. Today, I'm going to be focusing on a topic which is really incredibly important, because what tends to happen during a pandemic, during COVID, we're really thinking about a lot of the issues Rachel was talking about, which are extremely important. But I also would ask you to think about how you can also be thinking a little future-oriented, and that's what the topic is: HR as a driver of innovation. I've been talking about this topic for a number of years, since I came out with the book Innovative Intelligence, and it's a really crucial theme that I believe we should be addressing. And I'll just put up some of the materials just so you can see it. I also put in the chat box an article I wrote for Queen's University that is on HR as a driver of innovation, which is a further reinforcer of some of the ideas I'll be sharing here. So the first point is what the objectives are, and I'm going to focus on these three things. What's the compelling reason why HR should have a role as a driver of innovation? You might say, really, why would HR be the catalyst within an organization for innovation? And is that appropriate? Does that make sense? And what you might end up concluding is that, well, should we or should we not? And part of my argument is going to be that I think we really should be. The second thing is that what I'd like to do is I'd like us to think about, well, what are those key elements that we should be doing for this particular process? And in that regard, I'll ask you to think of 5 different things that I believe are going to be relevant here. And the final piece will be, what's this all mean to you? So give that some thought, and let me share this screen, and you can see what I'm actually looking at. So let's take this forward. So I'm going to be doing a great deal of thinking about this and sharing ideas with you. A lot of it came from this book that I wrote recently, Innovative Intelligence, and the other book, Leadership Driven HR. So they are other resources you can look to. I'm also very active on LinkedIn, and you're also invited to follow me. I do share a great deal of insights that I curate from the internet. There are lots of free articles you can download off the website. That's the first chat information that Rachel asked me to put up there. So that's the link to the website. One's called Free Articles. And the article that I just sent to you is over there under the HR part. There are about 40 free articles that I wrote on HR's role in developing innovative organizations. So let's get into it. What are the implications for at the end of this? I'm going to ask you to think about, what should HR do to drive innovation in organizations? So throughout, are you gleaning from this what role you might play as a driver of innovation? And also, I'm going to try to touch on some points of what HR should not do to drive innovation in organizations. And when we do work in innovation and we ask the question, which departments are the greatest barriers to innovation? It's an interesting question. The number one department within most organizations that is considered to be the greatest barrier for innovation is, in fact, finance. And that's because of financial rules, and the process of generating an innovative idea and implementing it generally doesn't give a quick enough return that you'd get through finance that meets the financial standards. But the second most is HR. And that's because we're so process driven, and we have lots of rules and lots of regulations, and the implication of doing something that we may not have purposefully thought about innovation and its implications for what we're doing there. We really do need to think about what HR should pull back from to allow innovation to occur, not only how HR can be a driver of innovation. So when I asked this question about what's the compelling reason for a focus on innovation, when I was using Slido, a lot of people said, well, you know what, there are really strong, compelling reasons why we're focusing on innovation in general. So growth, competitive advantage, the future, becoming more efficient, being relevant, alignment. So I don't think there's any doubt that organizations need to focus on innovation. But what's the compelling reason why HR should have a role as a driver in innovation? And let me suggest to you three things. Have you heard the term VUCA? It's quite popular. It's really an acronym for four words. V for volatility, U for uncertainty. It's even spelled wrong. That's how uncertain it is. The C for complexity, which means where there's really no precedent for it. We really are dealing with things that are new to what we might have experienced in the past. There aren't best practices, and ambiguous, where we have multiple stakeholders who have a different opinion. Now, when you flip the VUCA to the positive, it then becomes, what's our vision? What's our purpose? It's not about a destination, but who are we? And I believe that to get over this VUCA part, HR could play a role in helping us identify purpose and identify values. What do you really stand for? And how do you make sure that we expand the level of understanding? We know that in the world of change, it's no longer just tell people what to do, but people really need to understand why. And when Simon Sinek talks about start with why, all this is about understanding. We have to engage people and engage their minds that they understand what really is going on and why you're asking people to do things. And also curiosity. We have to recognize that in a world of complexity, in the VUCA world, we have a situation where, we need everybody's input. We need everybody's curiosity. We need everybody's perspectives on things to allow that kind of diverse viewpoints of things to help us get some insight into what might be a good idea. And finally, we need good agility. And the good agility is really saying that what we need to do is we need to get to a point where if change occurs, that we're able to adjust rapidly, and therefore nothing is going to be stable for a lengthy period of time. How do we actually build that agility to be able to change on a dime and move to another direction? So the compelling reasons why HR should have a role as a driver of innovation relate to VUCA. First of all, there is a dramatic innovation gap. The research that we did in innovative intelligence, the research by McKinsey, by Accenture, by Deloitte, many of them have come up with similar kinds of data that 80% of executives and leaders throughout the world in the public sector and private sector say innovation is essential, while only 30% are satisfied with what they have. Now, of course, they're not going to ever really be happy, but that 50-point difference is called the innovation gap, and that is extreme. That's well beyond just people who have high standards. And therefore, HR has a role to try to do its part to try to bridge that innovation gap, and maybe they're not the driver of innovation to deal with that, but at least they are a key player in trying to create an innovation culture, a culture that supports innovation, and ultimately allows people to be innovative in their workspace. But here's another point. One of the root causes that we found in the book Innovative Intelligence was that the innovation gap is due to a lack of leaders of innovation. I think that's the big idea in that book, which talks about, we've been for years saying we need to make you more innovative, but that really doesn't work because people are cognitively who they are, and they spend 30, 40, 50 years, and we're not going to just rapidly change you to becoming more innovative. But we can make you a leader who knows how to facilitate and coach others to draw out their innovative capacities of diverse teams. And HR has a key role to attract, develop, retain those kinds of leaders who are leaders of innovation. And I think that gives you, as HR, a very, very strong role as a driver of innovation, putting the talent in place that was able to work that way. And finally, all innovations, in a way, are a prequel to change. We have since, Human Resources Champions by David Ulrich adopted change management as one of the core capabilities of HR. That's been a successful advance of HR beyond hiring, developing, retaining employees, a life cycle of individuals. We have introduced an organizational systemic role, which is on leading change and change management. If we now think of innovation as what happens before change, it's not the only thing that happens before change, but whenever you have innovation, you're going to need to have change. So therefore, in reality, if you're showing the change management movie, the prequel to change is going to be innovation. And it could be innovation. So all I'm doing is I'm asking HR professionals to go earlier in the process and start influencing through putting leaders of innovation and through a few other things that I'll be describing that ultimately allows you to play a key role as one of the major drivers of innovation. So the second objective is, so what are those ways that HR can drive innovation in organization? And what I'd like to do is to share with you 5 ways that HR can drive innovation in organizations. So the first one is building leaders of innovation. I referred to that a little bit earlier. I'm going to explain it just a bit more in a moment. But we really need to build those leaders of innovation. In other words, not innovative leaders. In other words, that I'm the most innovative person. You might be able to hire that kind of person, which is great. But once you got them, I need to build you into a leader that is a leader of innovation that draws out the innovative capacities of others. The second one is, how do we make sure, and I believe HR has a role in this, that you can work with diverse teams, because their literature is vast, that innovation and design thinking all works best when you have diverse teams. So if you have silos in your organization, you are immediately limited in your ability to be able to generate innovation. So I'm arguing strongly that HR should take accountability for that alignment so that diverse teams can work together on innovation. The third one is focusing on user and employee experience and iteration. If you think about innovation and design thinking, one of the 2 core capabilities that are different than normal problem solving is, number one, the user focus, or the one who receives the experience as core sources of data, in addition to research and best practices. And the second thing is iteration, which means we're not going to get it right the first time. We're going to show a little bit, tell me what you think, get some feedback, fix it again, and do it again. So our ability to create a culture that allows for a focus on employee or user experience, customer experience, patient experience, and student experience, and iteration as the outcome becomes really crucial in that driving innovation. The fourth point is what I mentioned earlier about leveraging our change management. So I talked about innovation as the prequel to change management. What I'm suggesting is that in all our cultural research on how to get a culture that innovates, not a culture of innovation, but a culture that allows innovation to occur, one of the key features is innovation loses credibility if it doesn't get implemented. And our capability that we have on change management becomes something that we should be really applying to any kind of innovative idea to help accelerate the process of making it occur, because in fact, when that occurs, people feel all that effort was worthwhile and the credibility of innovation improves. And finally, that point that I talked about, the negatives associated with what might occur with inadvertent HR practices that might get in the way, we might have to modify HR practices that make innovation a little bit more difficult. And can we remove that barrier that sometimes gets created through processes that never intended to block innovation? That wasn't what it was, but inadvertently it is. So having strict rules, strict guidelines, over processing, and not allowing people to be innovative, to work cross-functionally, because our roles and responsibilities and job descriptions are so tight, our processes of how we negotiated our labor agreements, all these various things sometimes generate the accusation that HR is the block to innovation, which is the opposite, in fact, of what I'm trying to argue, that HR should be a driver of innovation. So let's take a look at each one separately. The first one is building leaders of innovation. And I'm not sure if people know Howard Gardner's work. He was one of the early thinkers that said there are multiple intelligences. For years, we operated with the mindset that the IQ was the most important intelligence, so your knowledge, your experience. And then he argued quite correctly, and he started with 7, he moved to 8 different intelligences, that, yeah, there is word smart and logic smart, but there also is nature smart, there's picture smart, there's body smart. There's hockey players, kids who play hockey, and they don't do well in school, but somehow they're brilliant at that. That's an intelligence. I mean, how come we can't recognize all these various intelligences? So built on that model, what we're dealing with is that there are many different intelligences we need to think about. And the argument is that in most organizations, we need leaders of innovation. And to be an effective leader of innovation, the argument is that you need 3 kinds of intelligences. The analytical intelligence on the bottom left, that one really is what you would measure in an IQ test. It's your knowledge, it's your experience, it really measures competence. Now, HR for years has survived on the resume when we search for talent. And what do we do in a resume? A resume is all about what's your academic knowledge and what is your experience that you've had, what is your job. And based upon that, we have made decisions about whether we should hire or not hire. In this new world of complexity, of VUCA that we talked about, that's not adequate anymore, because the kinds of situations we're facing are not necessary something that you would have gained through experience or knowledge. We're dealing with new situations that no one thought of before. They asked the question, what's the half-life of knowledge? And what that means is, at what point is half of what you know obsolete? And they tested on students entering into year 1 of university, and essentially, what's relevant by the time they graduate 4 years later. And the answer is 50% of everything you learn in year 1 is obsolete by the end of year 3. So experience and knowledge is important. It's not that it's unimportant, but it's not enough. And what we need to start thinking about is this curiosity, how do you handle complexity? How do you, engage in being user-centric and doing iteration and dealing with unknown situations where there are no research, where there are no best practices. And what we found also, that bottom one on the right-hand side, the emotional intelligence, that in fact, if you need to be able to say, I don't know, we need to discover what the real problems are in the innovative intelligence on that curiosity side, you're going to have the emotional maturity and self-awareness so that you're able to be able to say with courage that, there are some things I know and there's some things I don't know. It's because of that I decided to get certified in the EQI, because, I leverage that a lot in a lot of my sessions that I do, because, emotional intelligence seems to be a foundation even for the ability to be innovative. Because if you make it a scary environment, if you get anxious, if you've got derailers, then what will occur is people will be cautious and therefore not express their curiosity to you. And as a leader of innovation, you won't be able to draw that out. So it looks a little bit like this. Yes, we want to have, when we're selecting leaders, performance based upon the analytical intelligence, but we also need to have learning agility, people who are constantly learning, people who are open to new ideas. And that is a pretty good signal that the person is someone who has probably a lot more innovative intelligence. And on the emotional side, at minimum, make sure that they don't have derailers. So number 1, and this is relevant to selecting and promotion, number 1, to be a driver of innovation for HR, we need to focus on building, sustaining, retaining leaders of innovation even more than innovative leaders. Now, number 2 becomes ensure that diverse teams can work together on innovation. Now, this becomes, as I mentioned earlier, very important, because what we found is that groupthink is a very serious problem for most organizations. And when you put a complex problem where people don't necessarily know the answers or even what the problem is, then if you send it to a group of like-minded people, there is a high probability that they're all going to reinforce each other's beliefs, and they're going to come up with what they know. But if you put a diverse team together, then what ends up happening is they start working together and they give different perspectives with a leader of innovation helping them. And through that, you'll discover new insights into what's going on and discover new innovative solutions. So diverse teams is really essential to innovation. But if in fact we're working in an organization, well, let's say we have 4 areas. So if I'm in the public sector and one is policy, one is programs, one is operations, and one is administration. If I'm in the private sector, I've got my procurement, I've got my production, I've got my marketing, I've got my sales, all these various divisions that you might have within an organization. When in fact we have a situation where the handoffs between these areas are not effective, that's what we call a silo. If area 1 says, I have the right answer and therefore area 2 is the problem, you're not going to be able to get the diversity within the organization to be able to collaborate to start dealing with these complex kinds of problems in our VUCA world. So we need to focus on handoffs. So there's a few implications for HR as a driver of innovation. Number 1, when I work with VPs of HR and we're restructuring an HR department, and it's very popular now to have HR business partners, and if I'm training them or whatever the case is to be HR business partners, I strongly encourage that the accountability of an HR business partner is not just to the unit that they are partnering with, but also in the handoff that is coming to that unit, as well as the handoff that is going to the next unit. So are the handoffs between them working seamlessly and effectively? So if an HR business partner tells me, oh, we've got silos, and I say that's your accountability to be agitating in the organization to ensure that you're getting the parties together so that they can work out agreements, work out how they can collaborate with each other, understand each other's needs and interests so that, in fact, there aren't any silos. Because we need to have that diversity working across, and if we don't have that diversity, we'll have a suboptimized organization. And we also find that in the way that organizations work when they try to work with diverse teams, because I often encourage organizations, when they are working on complex issues, to bring in customers. Why is it only diverse teams within the organization? I was working in a hospital, and they were even doing a suggestion program where every 2 weeks they'd have a question, and they had an electronic way where everybody could participate, and the families and the people who were coming in were part of that program, and they were contributing ideas. The diversity was vast. And the more we can allow alternative thought into the process, the more effective we're going to be. So number 1 was build leaders of innovation. Number 2 is we have to work on that diversity of teams, and the key asset is the handoffs and breaking down those silos. Number 3 is focusing on what are the ways that we can have a focus on user experience and iteration. Now, this is an example, get into the shoes of your customer. This is someone who was working in a hospital, and he's a consultant, and he's just trying to experience, what do you see when you are in bed if you're bedridden? And in fact, that's what the camera is focusing on. That's all he sees for hours, and that's what he sees. He just sees this, roof. So make it more interesting. So it's the same thing, and we have to start building the user experience. This is an MRI machine, and it's GE MRI. And the question they asked in their thinking is, how might we reduce the extent of sedation needed for kids who require an MRI? And they came up with answers of how to, basically deal with the medication for children. But when they changed it to user experience, how might we change the experience for kids who require an MRI? They got away from just doing just a straightforward answer around sedation, and they generated something that was radically different, which was really about, maybe the sedation is what's required. I assume it is. We're not going to change that level of sedation if that's what's required for the MRI, but can we make the experience less anxiety provoking? And that ultimately was changed because we thought about changing the experience. And, so for example, how might we have employees return to the office post-COVID? We'll come up with, offices and have barriers and maybe rotating people in and out. But what if we ask the question, how might we change the experience for employees as they return to the office post-COVID? Now, that's a different question, and it might be in terms of how we engage them in a different way. Recent research found that no matter what you do, 25% of employees are going to be anxious and be unwilling to take the elevator in your organization. 25%. Under normal conditions, everybody would take the elevator, or maybe a few won't, but 25% is really high. And only 8% will be unwilling to basically use the stairwells. So that's interesting. 17% of the people are not going to use the elevator, but will now use the stairwells. Now, is that interesting in terms of the employee experience? I think it is, because that might mean that this might be the time to put up some posters in the stairwell, or paint the stairwell, make it a better place, because I'm going to use it because I'm afraid of using the elevator, even if you tell me to stand on opposite corners. So, and then we have to iterate. And this is an example of an iteration, again, in healthcare, which is basically showing you, this is with a story. Let me tell you what we anticipating doing, which, by the way, ended up looking like this. Or this was the early version, the iteration of the Apple Watch. And it basically was something that, you can say, well, that's ridiculous, but you showed that and said, imagine that this was smaller, had these capabilities. Would this interest you? And that created a conversation. We need to be better at that iteration and bringing it out to the customer. The fourth one is leveraging change management. And this one we talked about before, but the notion is that the change process is what gives innovation credibility. If innovation does not have a track record of being implemented, then in fact, you're going to find that innovation will suffer. So we become a driver as HR to implement innovations, and that is a way that we actually are a major asset to the innovative needs of an organization. So you got the change management implementation, but the innovation is the prequel. And therefore, let's make sure that we bring them across the finish line and put all of our assets there. So key success factor in a culture of innovation is the balance of innovative thinking with the discipline to implement solutions, and HR could drive innovation as the prequel to change. The final one is modifying HR practices that make innovation more difficult. Now, the way I've written about this for the people who've studied some of the work that I've written in leadership-driven HR, or the earlier works like in high-impact HR that I wrote 20 years ago, that, there are people capability, which is a life cycle. There are organizational capability like change management, like building culture, like, measuring HR, and then overall, what's your overall strategy? There are ways we can make innovation easier, but I really want you to think about what's the kind of things that we do that accidentally get in the way of innovation. So this one here is really quite fundamental and crucial. So what's the implications for HR professionals? I asked you earlier to think about what should HR do to drive innovation in organizations? And, what should HR not do to drive innovation in organizations? And I think it starts with who you are. So this is something I posted on LinkedIn. Who do I choose to be during COVID-19? Am I in that fear zone where I'm still anxious and I don't want to step forward, I'm locked? Am I in the learning zone, or am I in that growth zone? There's no right or wrong answer, but the more we can nudge forward, the more we'll be able to be an asset to the positive developments within your organization. And when I asked the previous group of about 30 people, how does HR drive innovation? Getting the right hires, rewarding, collaborating, educating, listening, doing, encouraging the curiosity. And what can you do to avoid it? Sometimes you got to say no if it's going to block innovation. Some policies are getting in the way, being closed-minded. These are the answers that HR professionals were giving me that might get in the way, like sticking with the system, or rigid in processes, or numerous rules. All these various things can ultimately get in the way and be problematic. So I want to, we have a few minutes left. I want to open this up to any questions. You do have in your materials way on the top, a my article that I submitted, and I'll submit it again. So this is an article I wrote for the Queen's University, and it's on HR as a driver of innovation. So it'll be an effective summary that you could share with other people about this. So let's take a look and see if there's any questions here. If anybody does have a question, thanks for your industries, career management, not-for-profits. I gave some quick examples in that space. This does definitely apply to retail as well. I've been teaching a lot at St. Mary's University. We have a wonderful program there on innovation in retail. It's called the Retail Innovation Program, Weiss. And if you're interested in that, it's actually a great space for a focus on retail to do that. I also teach at Schulich, and of course, I have my consulting practice, Weiss International. Any questions at this point that we might have? I don't see any, but I want to just close with, just a message that this is challenging times. And you're going to immediately get some pushback if someone says, deal with innovation and how do you drive it? Just stick to your COVID, just get us back in the office, deal with the crisis. And that is true. We need to be innovative in the way that we work in a virtual way. But don't lose sight on trying to think maybe 6 months, a year out. Eventually, hopefully in Canada, by the end of 21, there'll be vaccinations, and ultimately there'll be more activity back at work. We would have to also be thinking about how we can be an asset for the organization going forward. And I would really strongly suggest that HR is a driver of innovation, or at least as a key partner in the process of stimulating innovation, making a culture that allows innovation to occur, is something that all of us should be focusing on and ultimately giving attention to. I want to thank you very much, and thank you to the team at Toronto Jobs. It's been a pleasure collaborating with you, and all the best, everybody.
Hi, David. Just wanted to say thank you very much. That was fantastic. So I hope everyone checks out your articles, because I've read them and they are phenomenal. So I feel like a lot of work went in and research went into those pieces. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your expertise. We have a couple people here saying thank you so much, Dr. David, for your time. So thank you again, and it's always a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. All the best.
Yeah, our next sessions will start at 2:55, so there's a little bit of time for networking. So we have Laura Vaughn, who's going to be speaking about the abundant workplace, and we have Jody Tingling, who's going to be talking about building resiliency in challenging times. So those are our next 2 sessions, and in the interim, we have about 4 minutes for networking. So thanks again, David.
Bye-bye.